So I'm here with Sam Brake Guia. Did I pronounce that surname right? I've heard it on the podcast and Brains Byte Back, but it's a hard one to pronounce.
Yeah, you did. You did. Yeah. And it's quite funny because in the UK, most people get stuck on that last one. They're like Brake Guia, Brake Guia, Brake Guia. And but it's like the car parts, Brake Gear. So my friends back home call me Clutch because of that. I got two names.
Oh, that is a great nickname.
Yeah.
You need to get the people of Colombia to adopt that nickname. That would be a pretty cool nickname out there.
Yeah, I just got to get them to pronounce it first.
Do you know the origins of your surname?
So I'm not sure really. Like Gear is Venezuelan. So my granddad's from Venezuela. The rest of my grandparents are British, and that's where Brake comes from, my mother's side. But my father, he's half British, half Venezuelan. And Gear means guide in Spanish. But it's quite funny because Gear is actually a very strange surname. It's a very weird surname. Imagine, like, for example, it's kind of like Brake. I've never met anyone with a surname Brake. And I've been in Colombia for almost 4 years now, and I've never met anyone with the surname Gear. And even when I tell people my surname, I usually just go like Samuel Gear when people ask my name because it's easy. And then when they write it down, they're kind of confused. Even though it's a Spanish word, they're like, that's your surname? I mean, I suppose, yeah, it would be weird. It'd be like if your surname was Guide. I don't know. There is no real relation, but both Brake and Gear are very unique surnames for both parts of the world. So I'm pretty sure I'm probably the only person with my name in the world.
Well, it's funny you say that story because I too have a unique name. So I come from that school of unique names. My surname Colnut is a pretty rare one. And living as a kid growing up with a weird name, it gets thrown around a lot, mixed with other words. You end up with strange nicknames like what you've just said. But yeah, I've never known the origins of my name. And I looked at your name and I thought, well, you must be in a similar position. Funnily enough, and I hope to record this episode someday, I thought I was the only Scott Colnut in the world because I have quite a unique name. But it turns out there are two others, and I wanted to get them, all three of us, on an episode together. And I've tracked down one of them, and I'm in contact with them, but I can't track down the other one yet. So that's one of my goals.
How did you know there's two, but you've only managed to track down like one of them?
Well,
how was that?
Well, there might be more, but there are two that I know that are at least on the internet and have a presence on the internet. Okay. So I found them just through, what did I look at? I think just like Twitter and LinkedIn. And over the years, it's something I've thought about because I thought, I don't know, I've got this interest in language and names, and I don't really know anything about my family history. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to know if there's another Scott Colnut out there. Am I the only one? So one day I remember looking it up, and there's something that's even more strange about this is that, so I'm really into hip hop, and it turns out that the other Scott Colnut in the world is a Canadian rapper. So that's bizarre. And yeah, I'm connected with him. I've spoken to him and he's up for coming on the podcast. So I might record with him one day, but I think the other Scott Colnut is a bus driver in Canada as well, somewhere. So who knows? I'd like to get all three of us on. I don't have a clue what we talk about, but I just think it'll be interesting to know my namesake. And I imagine that would be quite fun for you to find out the other Sam Brake Gears out there as well.
Yeah. I'd be very interested they exist. Then I suppose one topic you could talk about, as you mentioned, is the nicknames you've all experienced as a result of having a unique name.
Yeah, no. And because we got straight into your name, I forgot to mention, so you are content producer and podcast host of the Loudspeaker by Publicize and Brains Byte Back by The Sociable. And we were just saying just before we started recording that I've not got a single topic in mind, and I think that's probably a reflection of you as a person. I'm interested in your career in podcasting, the diversity of the podcast episodes that you record. I find your journey just interesting, reading about your backgrounds, going from writing to podcasting, moving from Britain to Colombia, Medellín, and also I'm interested in the world of advertising and marketing. So your work with Publicize is really interesting to me too. You're a guest in today's episode, and does it ever feel strange for you as a host of podcasts to be a guest? Do you do guest appearances much?
Yeah, I try to, just because I like to get out there. I feel like being a guest on podcasts which are similar to what you work in, it's nice to speak to hosts. It's almost like people like on the same level. But one thing that I also find is I'm way more relaxed as a guest. I think as a host, I kind of feel this obligation to be like on point all the time, and just to kind of control the situation. It's almost like there's a lot of responsibility riding on me. And as well, you always have to have a response ready for the question or the answer from the person. And sometimes I don't always have one. So it's always like, oh, yeah, totally or definitely. But as someone that's being interviewed, you're kind of free to just express your thoughts, and there's less pressure to fit into a certain role. It's more you just have the opportunity to just respond freely, especially when it's on something which you're knowledgeable about, like all the things that we're looking to discuss today. I feel perfectly confident to discuss because they're things that I'm very passionate about and they come easily to me. So I would definitely say that I actually prefer being a guest rather than a host. I do like hosting. I very much enjoy it, and I hope for it to be my career for a very long time. But I definitely feel way more relaxed as a guest than a host.
And the reason I asked the question was because I'm interested to know, when people ask you what you do, what's your introduction to them?
It's kind of hard because I have to explain to them so many different factors of my job, because even then it's difficult to explain. But most of the time I just say I work in podcasting, or I'm a podcast host, and then usually they'll ask about what do I host, and then I explain the podcast to them, and that's fairly straightforward. But I try and keep it as basic as possible and just say maybe like podcast host, or I work in podcasting, and then if they dig deeper, then I'll like answer their questions. But otherwise I try to avoid detail unless they like pry further.
I kind of say that with something happened to me recently. I had a plumber in the flat, and he was asking me and my girlfriend what we do for careers. And my girlfriend's a singer and a DJ. It was pretty exciting. So someone's eyes light up when you say that. And then I told him I was in marketing, and he kind of just ignored me. And he didn't do it intentionally, but I knew he was more interested in the singing and DJing stuff. And so I just think when in marketing and in podcasting, it's not that I care too much about what people think when I introduce myself, but I realized that in that moment that when I said I was in marketing, I was probably doing myself a bit of a disservice, because marketing and podcasting and everything that I do is quite broad, but it's so hard to explain that I haven't really thought about how to introduce that in a way that's actually interesting.
Sometimes I find though that I prefer that, like when Colombians especially ask me and I need to explain what I do in Spanish, that adds another layer of complexity. So a lot of the time I just say marketing, and often I feel that I'm perfectly adapt to be a host in many cases, because I'm more interested to ask questions. So unless the person really demonstrates an interest in me or what I'm doing, and I clearly see they want to know more, I will often just respond with a basic description. So sometimes I'll just say like marketing, like podcasting, or something simple, so that I can then go back and ask them questions. I'll be like, I work in marketing. What do you do about this? What do you like? So I very rarely switch off this kind of like host mentality that I have, I guess.
Do you think that's a good thing, because it keeps you in, as in it's a comfort thing? You say that so that you can move on and move into host mode. So is it so that you don't have to talk about yourself?
Yeah, I think something like that. I also feel that if they have a genuine interest, like they want to know more, and you can tell that they want to know more, rather than just like asking questions about what you do for being polite, then I will definitely get into it. I'm more than happy to like go into what I do and how it works, and I get super passionate about it because I am super passionate about it. But also at the same time, one of my former managers said I remind her of a 4-year-old when they're going through that stage of asking why, and I think that is one of the best representations of who I am as a person. I'm very curious, and I'm often very curious of other people, and I feel that even though I do enjoy talking about myself as much as anyone else does, because we just naturally do, it's hardwired into us to talk about ourselves, I feel that I already know everything about myself, and if anything, I'm more interested in learning about other people. So there's not, I mean, yes, there is value in talking about what yourself and what you do, but I only really want to do it if the person is genuinely like really interested in what I do. Otherwise, I'd much rather learn about them and understand what makes them tick. I am the host of Brains Byte Back, which is a psychology podcast. My degree is in psychology. I'm super passionate about psychology, and I think that is evident whenever I meet someone. I'm so interested to find out more about them as a person and what makes them tick. I find that hard to switch off. So I would say it's equal parts host and equal parts psychologist.
It's so interesting you touch on that topic because it sounds similar to me in terms of personality type. I've said this on my podcast and other podcasts, in that even though I am a podcast host, I actually don't like speaking that much. I wish I could just sit here and you just know what I'm thinking and the questions that I want to ask, and just I'd sit here and listen to you talk without saying a word. I'm so curious about other people more than myself. But I say that it's interesting because for me, the challenge that I've always had in life, because I'm more interested and more curious about other people, it definitely makes me come across as aloof because I'm not very giving with information about myself. And so it's something I'm quite conscious of. Yeah, it's something that I'm quite conscious of. And I don't know, I think sometimes it possibly comes across as rude. And I've debated over the years how to manage that. But really, it's my personality. I can't force it. I can't change it. I just have to hope that people see the sincerity after they get to know me for a while and realize that actually it's not about me not wanting to share more of myself. It's more of me wanting to get to know, like, I think you used the phrase, what makes them tick, more about their lives and what they're interested in. Is what I'm describing to you something that you've been through yourself?
Yes. However, I would say that I think you underestimate potentially how much people like talking about themselves generally. I remember hearing once that people really do enjoy talking about themselves. There is something legitimately hardwired into us. So I think that when you're asking lots of questions, and maybe if you're not giving them so much information about yourself, people are just happy that you're showing an interest and they get to talk about themselves and the things they like. So I would probably say that there's probably only a small number of people that would probably look at that situation of you being aloof versus you being like keen or interested. And they're probably so caught up in the fact that they have someone to just talk about themselves to, that they probably would come away from the situation happier rather than, oh, that guy's a bit of a dick. He didn't tell me anything about himself. So I'm of that impression. I think it's better to ask more questions than answer them, or you're more likely to leave a better impression with someone if you ask more questions than spend your time talking about yourself. So I think it's probably going to be all right. I think I wouldn't worry too much about it. It sounds like we're probably on the same page, but my perspective is that it's a good disposition to have.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's advice that I'm going to take into my life. I don't really know why I touched upon it or thought about it. Really, it's just something upon reflection that I think another thing that's on my mind is I've been talking a lot about introversion lately. I consider myself an introvert, but like a confident introvert. I'm happy to talk and I'm happy to ask questions, but generally I'm quite introspective. So and it's not like I spend a lot of time selfishly thinking about myself and how people see me. In fact, I probably spend too little time on that. But I do spend a lot of time internally digesting world issues and my own curiosity. And actually, just as you said that, my own curious mind got the better of me, and I started to think about situations where, yeah, maybe I've asked a lot of questions and the challenges and successes I've had in that. I think the other challenge that comes to mind as I'm thinking about it is you also don't want to overstep or pry. And so actually that's quite an interesting challenge as a host, is to know when to. I'm generally of the approach that I'm happy to go into uncomfortable areas of conversation, but it's a really difficult thing to gauge. Is that something that you've experienced as a podcast host? And yeah, I guess any thoughts on how to approach those topics that you're curious about, but might be sensitive?
Yeah, I would say that that's definitely an area that I'm always trying to work on. Not just in hosting, but in everyday life. I feel that because I'm not afraid of conflict. If it's necessary, then it's very much like yourself. I would say I'm a confident introvert, but at the same time, I don't necessarily want to start it or unnecessarily start a conflict. So I do find that when I am hosting my show, I have people on, and to my detriment, to some extent, I enter these shows with them as a guest, and I see them as an expert. So I don't necessarily question or challenge a lot of things. I would say I do challenge them, to some extent, but it's not necessarily like you would ever expect on some kind of like political show or anything like that. I feel that a show that I host, I could be a little bit more, I don't think aggressive is the right word, but I suppose critical of some of the things that my guests bring to the show. But again, I don't want it to be a space where it's this kind of black versus white, yes versus no. I want it to be a place where people can learn facts. I want it to be like indisputable facts. So I want it to be a place where there is research, evidence, and where if there is any kind of belief, it's backed up with empirical research and evidence. So I don't really want it to be a place where people come with opinions. I want it to be a place where people come with facts and evidence to inform our listenership. And that's really what I try to achieve on Brains Byte Back. So I think I probably am a little bit relaxed in that sense, but that's because that's the kind of environment I'm trying to create on the show. A place where people can come with their knowledge or findings or research and showcase that to an audience without someone, I suppose, like trying to tear them to pieces.
Well, yeah, that's interesting as well. And I've just thought about something as you were speaking, is that we are hosting people's time as podcast hosts, and time is such a valuable asset. So I guess the challenging thing, thinking that through, is as a podcast host, I am conscious of the fact that someone has given me their time. And so I don't want that to be a bad experience for them. And so it's a fine balance for me of making sure their time is enjoyable, but also making sure that the value I'm giving within the podcast is of use to the world and of use to listeners and to myself. And I think that's an interesting space to be in as a podcast host, is knowing, you don't want someone's experience to be bad. And also word gets round. So you might have a guest, if they have a poor experience with you as a host, that can have an impact on other people that might potentially want to come on your show. As I'm saying this, I'm talking myself into this thing, which I'm fortunate that I don't think about this stuff too often. But you spoke at the beginning about podcast hosting being quite a responsibility. And the more that I talk, the more that I realize that, that hosting of people's time is such a big responsibility.
Oh, I hope I haven't installed some like seeds of doubt of you being like, crap, there's too much.
No, that's what I love. No, that's what I mean. That's what I love. I mean, that's the environment that I love to create, those kind of conversations. It makes me realize that now what I don't know and what I often like to get to the bottom of is I kind of like to know, in a way, why I don't think of that. Why have you just prompted that thought now, and why haven't I thought about that before? And it makes me conscious, like I said, if I'm utilizing and people's time and they're giving me their time, I just want to make sure that they have the best experience possible. But if you're interviewing, you've got to make sure that you still ask questions that surface value in a very, very fine line. Just trying to think of who does that particularly well. And actually, I mean, we're talking on the advertising hour, and most of my shows are around an hour long. But you just mentioned something about Joe Rogan, and I appreciate that a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people he interviews are acquaintances or friends of friends. But he's taking up 3-4 hours of people's time. They're flying in. It must be a lot of responsibility to host that. You've got to make sure that's worth people's time as well.
Yeah, and he also has such a large listenership that it must be intense to go live on a show. I don't know how it works now he's moved over to Spotify, but I can't even begin to imagine what that's like to broadcast to millions of people live in a studio like that. But
how that might influence your question asking and decision making about the topics that you choose. That must be, there's a lot of pressure and a lot of decision making that must go into that we don't see. And the other thing that I'm thinking is that it's largely, I don't know about how this works for you, and again, feel free to give me as much information as you want, but from what I've seen in my podcast experience in the community, most of it's free. So most people are giving their time for free. And most people aren't doing paid podcast appearances. That hasn't really entered the podcast community from what I can see. So it's not only their time they're giving up, but they're giving it up for free, which is another additional responsibility.
I would say on that point, though, I think this feeds back into what I was saying earlier, that people really do enjoy talking about themselves, and people are more than willing to give up their time and give it away for freely if you give them a platform. to let them talk about themselves and their thoughts and their beliefs. So I think that's probably the greatest like currency they get from it, the opportunity to do exactly that.
No, that is really interesting in an age like today where so many people we think about gratification and likes. And I remember you recorded an episode around this recently about social media for good, I think it was.
Yeah.
I remember, yeah. Yeah, and it makes me realize that, yeah, perhaps you're right. Perhaps people are aware. I feel like people are generally aware that boom podcasting is experiencing right now. And so that and the gratification and the influence that people hope to possibly generate from the medium, tied in with what you've just said, tied in with the fact that to do that, all they have to do is talk about themselves. It's quite narcissistic in a sense. I don't know if I worry about that for the future or not. And that's an interesting role of the podcast host as well, because you've got to make sure that you talk about topics that are actually, like I said, of value and of a certain uniqueness. Because if all people are doing is leveraging podcasting to talk about themselves and their own experience without any real critical thinking, again, another topic that I know that you covered on the Brains Byte Back recently, then what value does that provide to the world?
But I think it's also a good thing in the sense that anyone can start a podcast now, but not anyone can start a successful one. I think that coming back to it, like you said, that value is important. And it's almost like the survival of the fittest, but instead of survival of the fittest, it's survival of the most valuable. So those that add value, whether that's imparting information or sharing information or delivering entertainment, however they add value to their audience, those ones are going to be successful. And the ones that are kind of narcissistic and don't really add value and it's just a place for them to talk, then they're not really going to thrive or survive, and they're not going to make it through this kind of survival of the most entertaining or the most value-adding podcasts. So I think that there's a natural order within podcasting and a natural kind of Darwinianism. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Of just like the best podcast will survive, and those that just don't understand how to make valuable podcasts, they're going to die out eventually, probably.
I had intended coming into this, starting off this way. I want to know about how you ended up in podcasting. So I want to know a little bit more about your career, because just reading about it on paper, it's actually quite fascinating to me. And actually thinking out loud, anyone that ends up in podcasting at the moment, it's pretty fascinating because it's in its infancy. And so you kind of have to fall into it, unless maybe you've come from a radio background and have gone into it. You kind of have to, you find that people fall into it from different industries, or perhaps it's not a full-time career and it's maybe a side project or a personal project or something like that. So I'm going to start off from what I remember reading. I think you were over in the UK and studying in my home city of Portsmouth. Was that right?
Yeah. I was studying psychology. That's where I did my degree.
And then how long was it between your degree before you ended up at Publicize and over in Colombia?
So I graduated in 2014. I then went back to my home city. I consider it my home city. I was born in Bristol, and that's where most of my family live. But I grew up in Devon, in Exeter. And I moved back to Bristol after my degree. I spent about a year and a half there, and I was working in a sales job. I was doing quite well, making some decent money, and I was happy there. Well, I say happy. I had a good life with good people around me, but I just knew that I always had a desire to live outside the UK, live in a different culture, in a different part of the world, and above all, learn another language. And I just thought, you know what, I have to do this. And I was 23 at the time, and I just decided, I got to go out there. I've got to go and just explore the world and find somewhere where I want to live for an indefinite amount of time. And I'd saved up a bit of money, and I bought a one-way ticket to the US. I gave away all my possessions, and anything that didn't fit into a small box that I gave my parents or into my backpack, I just gave it away. And went to the US, spent a bit of time there, then went to Central America, back to US to see some family, and then I went to Mexico, and I traveled from Mexico down to Colombia by bus. And then when I got to Panama, I had to cross over by boat. It took a couple of days, a few days, and then I arrived in Colombia. And when I arrived in Medellín, so this was about 8 months. I arrived in Medellín about 8 months after I left the UK. So that's 8 months of traveling around North and Central America and through those places. And when I arrived here, I was like, this is it. This is the place that I want to be. So I said to myself, you know what? I'm going to spend 2 years living here in Medellín. I'm going to learn Spanish, and then I'll keep traveling. But 2 years will be 4 years in April, and I'm very happy here. I love it, and I hope to get residency once my visa comes to an end. And yeah, I have no intentions of leaving at the moment. And when I arrived here in Medellín, I was looking for work. I want to become an English teacher, but it's not a good place to become an English teacher without experience. It's very saturated, and the job opportunities aren't very good, and I couldn't find a way of getting a visa. So I started writing online just randomly for like, I don't know, like $5-10 an article, trying to make money however I could. And then someone put me in touch with Publicize, a startup here. It was very small. I had only been around for a few years, and it focuses on PR for startups and small companies. And yeah, someone put me in touch with an internship as a writer to start writing for the media department they have here, because they owned a number of publications. And I started doing that. So I started dividing my time working as an intern on the PR side, so helping out writing content for clients, and also writing content for our publications on the media side of the PR company. And that is when I got into writing, but it was never really my passion. I actually randomly came across a podcast called Two Dope Queens, and I got into it because Jessica Williams, she was a comedian on The Daily Show, and I loved her. She was hilarious, and she actually left and started this podcast, and I thought, well, I'll check it out. I ended up falling in love with it. It's a stand-up comedy show based in New York, and I realized, wow, this is incredible. I've never realized that I could enjoy audio as much as I could, like visuals or TV. And the podcast has now been turned into a TV show. It's basically just stand-up comedy. But it made me realize how much entertainment and enjoyment you can get just from like a podcast, just from putting your headphones in. And the best thing is I realized that my eyes could take a break. So I could go to bed and I could listen to this before going to sleep. I could do other tasks, and it really enhanced my productivity, my ability to just multitask and enjoy other tasks that I was doing at the time. And that's when I fell in love with podcasting. I put the idea forward for us to have a podcast for our number one publication, The Sociable, based on psychology and technology, which is mostly what I was writing about at the time. And that got picked up by my bosses. They loved it. And within the first few episodes, I had the vice president of McAfee on the show. I had Nick Casey, who's the Andy's bureau-in-chief for the New York Times. And yeah, it was just a really good start. And since then, we're about, 60 shows in now. And also Publicize, the company I work for, asked me to do a podcast and help out with that for them. So it's a PR marketing podcast. So I now host Brains Byte Back for The Sociable and the Loudspeaker for Publicize. And it's kind of just grown from there. And now it's become a full-time job where I focus on podcasting, and I'm constantly looking to improve my skills and really just build these two podcasts out to be the best that they can be.
Just so I've understood it correctly, so are Publicize and The Sociable connected in any way?
Yeah. So Publicize is paired with Espacio. So it's kind of two companies in one. Espacio is a media incubator, and there's a number of publications that they look after, hold, and publish. Articles, videos, just general. It's a media kind of like company in that sense. And Publicize is its sister company. So it's quite good to have the two together, because obviously it's kind of a harmonious relationship between media outlet and Publicize is like PR and clientele. And it's a good partnership in that sense. But I'm one of the few people that work in between the two, because I've been doing it for so long. And I have such a strong passion for content creation that my skills kind of fulfill both parts, creating content for Publicize on behalf of the marketing team, and then also creating Brains Byte Back for The Sociable, because it's become quite an important component for The Sociable.
And there's so much that I want to unravel from that story. It's funny, as you were talking, I was kind of visualizing in my head the almost like you as an arrow traveling across the globe and the journey you had taken down geographically to end up where you are now. And there's a big part that you skipped over, understandably, because we don't have hours and hours to talk about that part. But I'm curious to know, when you left the UK to go on that journey, did you have any idea in mind about what you wanted to do, just in terms of to earn money as a career?
No. So actually, it was bizarre. It was almost like I saw it as a game. I remember thinking back to myself, right, I've got this stash of money. I want to leave the UK and I want to spend as much time as I can outside of the UK. I want to postpone that moment of crap. I'm out of money. I've run out. It's game over. I got to buy a ticket and go home, go back to my parents' house and start from square one. I just said to myself, keep going, be positive, find a way, like whatever you do, just keep working to be outside the UK, to keep traveling, to live abroad, to keep learning another language, keep growing and keep growing outside of the UK. Because even though I love my home country, I love the UK, I love being from Bristol, it's one of my favorite cities in the world. I just don't have a desire to live there. I mean, the UK is expensive and we have crap weather. I mean, we're recording this in December, so you're probably going through it right now. And it's those mornings of waking up. I remember one morning in January waking up to go to work and it was still dark outside and it was cold. And I was like, I have one of the strongest passports in the world. Why do I not just go live in a sunny, hot country? So I think for me, I didn't really have any knowledge or ambition to get into podcasting or anything like this. I just left and thought to myself, just find a way to survive and keep going, keep moving forward. And yeah, it was just by chance that all these things kind of fell into place. And like I said, when I first started here in Medellín, I knew, right, I want to be here. I found the place. Now I just need to find a means to support myself here and stay here, get a visa and do all those things. And that's why I started trying to teach. I had a TEFL before I left the UK because I thought to myself, you know what, worst case scenario, I can always teach English. And I applied for many places, but there were terrible offers and opportunities. And also, they didn't support my visa, so I was really struggling to find anywhere. And I remember teaching. I even went around Medellín and I printed out a ton of flyers and just like stuck them to lampposts and stuck them to places, being like, English teacher, native English teacher. I will work for like, I don't know, like £5 an hour or something, even like less than that, because it's not too expensive out here in Colombia, so I can get by on very little. And that's why when I started writing online, I was just doing whatever I could to get money. I remember when I got my first $10 from just writing an article. It was a crap article and I'd never really spent any time writing before. But I just remember being like, yes, I made $10. I can do this. If I get another $10 and another $10, I'll be able to pay my rent and get food and all this sort of thing. So it was really just that kind of hustler mentality. I was determined to make it and then not ever have to end up in that situation of, crap, I have to go back to the UK. I remember when I first arrived in Medellín in 2017, and towards the end of the year, I remember I used to have dreams where in my dream I was back in the UK and I was like, no, I failed. No, like, what am I doing here? Like, and in my dream I would panic and be like, no, that like, I want to be back in Colombia. I want to be back in Latin America. I don't want to be here. And I just remember in my dream, I was back home at my parents' house and back to square one. And I was like, it felt just like failure. And then I would wake up and I would still find myself in Colombia and I would be like, oh, it's just a dream. I'm still here. Like, I still doing okay. So yeah, that's basically like how it all happened. And fortunately things are good today. I'm in a job that I like, and I gotta say, Publicize has always treated me well. And yeah, I'm still loving Medellín, so it's good. It's good.
Why Medellín? I never really grasped as you were talking what attracted you there. And I asked that knowing only two things about Medellín. One is the obvious, is that the attention brought to Medellín because of Narcos. And from what I understand, that brought a lot of local tourism, which I'm curious to know actually whether locally that's how that's received. And the second thing that I know, and this is just through observation, just being in the marketing world, being on social media, is it seems to be a real hub for startups and tech companies. And I don't know if that's true or not, so I'm just curious to know.
Yeah, well, first of all, the reason why I love it here, there's a number of reasons. The weather is incredible. So all year round, it's sunny. You can wear a t-shirt and shorts all year round. We only have rainy season and dry season. And even during rainy season, you can still wear a t-shirt and shorts. And as long as you're inside, it's fine. So that is a huge plus. The city itself is beautiful. Like just visually, it's in like a valley. You have the whole city is spread out. And you can just see at night lights everywhere on either side of you. And you're surrounded by what feels like a sky of stars. Like that's what it feels like to me. And I look out my window and there's just a whole valley of just lights and mountains around you. So that for me is like wonderful. The nature here is incredible. It takes you very little time to just get out the city, and you can go on a hike, and the mountains are amazing and the views are incredible. And also, one thing which is very unique to Medellin is it has really good transportation. It has a metro system, like an above ground metro system. So it's quite easy to get around, and it's very advanced, definitely for like Latin American standards. And the price of living is very cheap. So I mean, it's like 50p a beer. So you can say that like it's easy to live a good life here on very little. And I think that kind of feeds into the next point I was going to make. And I'll get back to the narco tourism thing, but it is a good spot for entrepreneurship because of that, because you got talent, which is like hardworking, like talent, and they're going to be at a price which is perhaps lower than the US. So you could like create a startup here with people that are willing to work hard, and you could probably strive to last a lot longer than if you're based in San Francisco or New York. And we're on the same time zone. As it stands, we're on East Coast time. So I think in that sense, it's a really good place for startups. And like I said, when you have a wonderful quality of life, people are naturally going to want to live there. So it's not hard to convince foreigners to come live here. This place is packed with foreigners. And on the topic of foreigners, yes, this is the hometown of Pablo Escobar, and it's well known for Medellin. It's well known for narcos. And before I moved to Medellin, this is all I knew about the place. Like I remember watching Narcos, and I never in my wildest dreams thought that's going to be my future home. And when I arrived here, that is literally all I knew of it. So I did all those things. I went on the Pablo Escobar tour. I saw the place where he died. I went to his grave, went to the neighborhood that he built. And I was like everyone else, like super into it and curious. But yeah, now my kind of feelings towards it haven't changed dramatically. I think beforehand I didn't really understand like the impact that it had on the people here. Like I have been to places where he's like bombed the places, and I've also spoken to people that have lived through a lot of the violence, because it's not just isolated to what Pablo did, but also to the other kind of areas, especially when it comes to the armed forces and armed terrorists like ELN and FARC. So there's like it's one small piece of a larger kind of issue that Colombia's gone through over the past, I don't know how many years of violence here. So it's definitely quite painful for the people here, and especially since many of the people come here for cocaine and narco tourism. And it's particularly tough because I wouldn't say because coming here to experience stuff related to Pablo Escobar, that the only way that kind of hurts the local people is they just don't want to be associated with that. I suppose the best way of putting it into perspective is imagine if people only went to London to go see the site of the 7/7 bombings. You'd be a bit like, what? Like, really? You just want to come to London to see where like a load of people died or terrorist attacks and like something which is like kind of a hard memory of your city. And that's what the whole world knows you for, especially when you have a city which is as wonderful as it is here. And yet the only thing people really know it for is that dark history. And when it comes to like cocaine, it's particularly difficult because even though you don't see it in the city, in a lot of rural areas, there's a lot of issues with armed forces and narco terrorists, and they cause a lot of violence and trouble in the country. So, for example, they'll take over indigenous land and they'll just enslave the people and force them to produce cocaine. And if they don't meet like quotas, then they kill them. And a lot of people that have like protested or stood up against them have died, hundreds of people. And it's particularly an issue in rural communities and for indigenous people here. And the current government doesn't have, as it stands, the best like approach to it. They just fumigate the crops. And the issue with that is when the crops are fumigated, that obviously means that the local people don't meet their quota, and then they face very horrific kind of consequences as a result. So it's kind of sad that people come here with this idea of like what they expect to see or what they expect to experience from their Colombia experience. And the first thing they think of is something which is innately very kind of painful for the local people to have lived through. And you find that the majority of Colombians hate cocaine and really have very mixed feelings towards foreigners that do it, because it really is just the foreigners that do it here, as far as I've seen from living here anyway. Well, the majority of them. I mean, you do get some Colombians, but they're few and far between in that sense. So I think that hopefully those answers help shine some light on your questions there.
The funny thing to me is the burning question in my mind, tying it back to your career, is do you think in that sense Medellín has a PR problem?
Yeah, I would say so. But I would also say that it's kind of disappearing in the sense that everyone that I bring here loves it, and everyone that visits me completely understands why I like living here. And the more people that visit this place, the more they go back and tell their friends, oh, it was amazing. And they won't just say, oh, like, yeah, the cocaine was great. They'll go back and they'll say, yeah, it was a beautiful place. Yeah, it was really wonderful. The people are so nice. This is so great. You should go visit this place or this mountain. And I think it's the case of when you've never been here, or if you only base your understanding of Colombia on what you see in the news or in films or TV, then you're going to have a certain expectation of what it is. But when you come here and you truly experience it in person, then that completely, I suppose, minimalizes what you first thought of it. And you have a new kind of understanding of what this country is about and what this place is about. So I'm confident that with greater tourism, and there's a hell of a lot of tourism here, I'm always walking around. Our office is in the most touristic neighborhood. So it's a bit of a pain to just walk around as someone that lives here and constantly be identified as a tourist. Like, hey, how long are you here for? And you just get foreigners asking you these questions. You're like, no, I live here. I have a cat. I have a apartment with furniture. I'm not just here as a backpacker. But it's kind of good to see in a way. And people like that. People, even if people do come here for narco-tourism, I think that they'll probably leave with an understanding that that's not just what Medellín's about.
And in a way, I was just thinking, in a way, you're contributing to that solution, both in your work, in podcasting, and just in guest appearances like this, contributing to the life of Medellín that a lot of people don't see. So I think that's a great contribution to that problem as well. I love this idea of you writing for $10 articles, kind of finding your way, and then eventually getting your foot in the door at Publicize, and then expanding to other opportunities. I am curious to know, there's a lot to what you're doing which you've had to learn over the last few years. So as I'm looking at what you do, it's number one, just writing, getting your head down, writing articles, and then that's one thing. Then taking that ability and applying it to a company like Publicize and doing it in a more professional setting. So you're then having to write around specific topics. You have to hone that craft. And that translates then to audio and video content, which you end up producing. So my question here is, how are you learning all these skills? This seems to be, for me, that you spent a few years learning all of these different skills, building this incredible career in Medellín. And I'm just curious to know, how did you find the time to learn these skills? Is it on-the-job learning? How are you learning?
Yeah, it's exactly that, on-the-job learning. I have to say, one thing that I love about Publicize is they're very open to new ideas and very experimental, and they give us a lot of freedom. And I've certainly experienced a lot of freedom to just pursue what I love and what I enjoy. And it's allowed me to be very experimental. So definitely, I would say that it's all on the job learning. I other than what I produced in my university degree while studying in Portsmouth, I'd never really had any experience of really writing, certainly not in a kind of journalistic sense. So I completely learned that on the job. And then when it came to podcasting, exactly the same. I mean, I could listen back to the first episode of Brains Byte Back now and I probably cringe. But at the same time, like, it's been a process. So I would definitely say that I'm still so far from done. I have skills in all of these areas, but they're skills that I want to keep working on. I need to keep building on. And I'm still working on whenever I can. So I teach myself a lot of this. I have a natural curiosity, obviously, when it comes to podcasting. I follow Pod News. I don't know if you're aware of that. Like, I subscribe to their newsletter, and every morning I read that. So I'm constantly up to date with what's going on in the world of podcasting. I listen to podcasts every day. I'm currently on Podcast Marketing Academy, a 16-week course by Jeremy Ennins, and that is really helping me. So essentially, like, I'm trying to take in knowledge as much as possible, as fast as possible, and then incorporating it where I can. So I would also say that I'm not necessarily a specialist in any of these things. So I would say that I have a greater knowledge than your average Joe. But at the same time, I would nowhere near say that I would be on par with someone that's running like a podcast production company, or they're a CEO or anything like that. I still have some way to go before I'm at that level. But I think, like, within the next couple of years, I hope to, be above and beyond what I am now. I'm just working on it every day, and I would say that I still got a lot to go. Yeah, but it's passion. I'm driven by passion, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I can tell. And a lot of praise, as you said, has to go to publicize for creating an environment where you can explore your curiosity. Because I speak to so many people that they have these curiosities or they have this passion, but they maybe don't have the freedom in their paid 9-to-5 job to explore that. And I think what's interesting to me as you're talking is, so you've been, again, exploring the world of writing, media, and now podcasting over only a period of maybe 3 years?
Yeah, 3 years
4
or so.
years, 3 years. And your learning has accelerated so fast in that time. I can hear it and see it in your work. And it just goes to show what can be achieved if you create a culture where that's encouraged, or creating a culture where people can explore those interests. Do you think there's anything specific that you can point to at Publicize that allows you to do that? So is it management and their approach to learning? Is it something that they consciously try to do, or is that just part of the culture?
Yeah, I would say it is a part of the culture, and it has been the whole time I've been there. Because when I joined, it was incredibly small. I don't know how many people were there, but it's definitely a fraction of what it is now. And I've seen it grow so much. And I have to say, one of the reasons why I think it has done well is because they have been very experimental and very free. I have to say, the one thing that's kept me at the company so long as well is the people. I really get along with them. I think management is always open to new ideas. That management is always listening. And I have been fortunate enough to constantly be in a position where I've been able to put something forward, make an argument for it, and I've been able to go ahead with it. But I also think one of the most important things out of all of this is passion. So I think that if you inspire people to follow their passion, and it's a productive way. So obviously, like, my passion is podcasting, and no one else works in that. And podcasting is something which has been growing. So it makes sense for them to say, "Hey, Sam, go do it. Like, go get into podcasting. Go and find out as much as you can, and see what we can do in this, and let us know what you want to do or what you think's best." And I think that's the case for any company. If you try and get people to follow their passion and say to them, like, what is it about your job that you enjoy the most, and how can we amplify that, then I think you're probably going to get the best out of people. So I have to say that passion is the one thing. They push me to follow my passion, and they've kind of reciprocated that in that sense and just given me the freedom to go for it.
It's funny because I manage a team in a marketing agency, and I like to create a culture that's similar to the one you're describing, or attempt to. And I quite often use the phrase that I like people to come to work and play to their strengths, because it's pointless for a team for people to come to work and not utilize the skills as best as they can. But as you're talking, I think what's more important, even though it's not a phrase in my vocabulary or hasn't been until this point, is that I want people to, both in the company that I manage, but just in the world of creativity, it's important for people to come to work and play with their curiosity. You've got to take that curiosity and apply it in some form, or explore it in some form. And so I think that's actually a more important phrase for allowing people to flourish and allowing them to accelerate their learning and their career. And you're living proof of that, which is, interesting to reflect on. And so as you're talking, it sounds to me that you've explored elements of writing, and I know you've explored video production and that aspect, but podcasting is really where your heart is set on improving into the future. Is that fair?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's one of the things when I recently did apply for this academy that I'm on at the moment. I made a pitch to the guy, Jeremy Ennings, why I wanted to be on here. And it kind of gave him some background on what this means to me to join this course. And I did say exactly that. I was like, this is what I'm passionate about. This is what I want to work in. And I'm very fortunate that we're living in a very golden age of podcasting, because it seems like I've come along at the right time and it's all kind of just worked out, because this is definitely something that I hope to do for a long time.
So on that note about what you're doing now, I'm curious to know how much of your daily role, your daily job, or even just your day in general is committed to podcasting in comparison to maybe some of the other things that you work on. Are you still writing, for example? Are you still working with like the creative department on other projects? How much of podcasting is your daily work?
Yeah, so it's almost entirely all my day. The only other thing that I work on here at Publicize is video. So I am a multimedia content creator focused on audio and video. So if you go onto Publicize's YouTube channel, there's lots of videos, or a number of videos of me presenting ideas and tips. So I basically write the script for these like videos, and I present them. I work with a videographer. He records them and then edits them. So we work on that together. I also work with a graphics department to make animated videos. I produce the voiceover, I write the script, and then we put them out there, like explainer videos to explain our services or what we do. And I'm mostly focused on that outside of podcasting. But I would say podcasting is still predominantly the main focus that I work on, because there's so many components to it which take up so much time, like planning episodes, sourcing guests, writing scripts when necessary, editing them, distributing them on our podcast platform, and so many other parts in between that it takes up quite a lot of time. So I would say the majority of my time is focused on that, but otherwise I do also work on video production, which is another passion of mine, but I definitely prefer audio content just for the sake of the simplicity of how easy it is to create and produce, because producing video content is way harder, and it takes so much more time and energy that it can be a stressful process.
And I want to go into podcasting and your podcast that you host in a bit more detail, but I've just remembered a question that I wanted to ask you related to learning some of these skills. Is that, so what's interesting to me is you're going through this process of learning a lot of new skills at a new time, and when you accelerate learning like that, it's completely different to academic learning. So academic learning typically teaches you one way of doing things, but now you're learning on the job. It's a completely new way of learning. And what kind of formats work well for you? So do you learn through osmosis? So you're listening to podcasting and that naturally helps you pick up tips. Do you listen to podcasts about, for example, video production or marketing that help you fulfill that area of your role? Are you a reader? How do you learn?
So I would say it's a little bit of everything. I try and follow newsletters where I can, or subscribe to people that send out information related to podcasts, and keep up with that. I definitely listen to a lot of podcasts, and I factor in anything that I learn if I think, oh, that's interesting what they've done there, or how they're using that. I definitely like to learn from others when I can, so that obviously means like YouTube videos. And again, just like, I suppose it goes back to subscribing to people, I guess. But trial and error is another thing as well. I don't really like doing that because it's a very long process and there's no point reinventing the wheel when you don't have to. But as someone that works in a company where I am the only specialist in podcasting, it means that I either have to find a way of learning something online or just trying things out myself. And it kind of comes back to that very experimental mentality and process that we have here at Publicize. So it's a bit of everything, really, but very much, learning on the job and as I go.
And so most of your day is taken up by podcasting, and that's a core part of your work now. And by the way, as you were talking through that part, I was smiling because I love it when things fall into place. And that's not to dismiss your hard work, but there are certain parts of your story that you've talked about today where things seem to have fallen into place really naturally for you. And it's quite fascinating to think about that. And it's actually enjoyable to hear of stories about when that happens and you're in it right now doing what you want to do on pretty much a full-time basis and you want to continue doing it. And actually, as I'm thinking about that, my question for you is, despite the amount that you love it, so I really, really enjoy podcasting, but I've still found myself at times with a podcast looming, thinking to myself, oh no, there's this podcast this evening, I'm low on energy, or that follows this other thing that I've got on. Now, that could just be me because I've got a more diverse role. Like I said, I'm managing an agency. Podcasting isn't a full part of my day. But do you still experience that with podcasting there are energy levels that are hard to maintain, or is that just really easy for you because you're so passionate about it?
Oh no, definitely. Yeah, definitely. To answer your question, yes, I definitely suffer from all of those issues that you mentioned. And I think that there are two main hurdles that I face in this job. Is one, when I don't see the growth that I want, or when I really think an episode is great and I'm super happy about it, I put it out and it gets an average amount of listens, and I'm like, what am I doing wrong to not get the results that I want here? Or like, how long is it going to take? Like, I always thought I'd be way further ahead than I am now, and it's really hard to get content out there and get people to listen to stuff because you're just competing with so much. There's just so much entertainment and content out there that it's a really tough competition, and that can be very disheartening. And the other thing is sleep. I mean, like, the worst thing that I found is when I have a load of interviews lined up and the night before I just have awful night's sleep, and it's just so irritating because I'm like, great, now I have to be on point, I have to be host mode, and all I want to do is just go back to bed, and I'm so tired. And it kind of feels like acting in a weird way, but it's almost, I don't know, it's almost harder because there's no script in my podcast, so I feel I have to be very much on point, very articulate, regardless of what's going on. And I definitely feel that way, so I completely relate to you in that sense. And I do face those challenges, so I would say those are the two main challenges that I face when it comes to this role that I'm in at the moment.
Yeah, that makes me feel comfortable, so thanks for sharing that. And the reason I say it is because sometimes you question how much you love something when those thoughts enter and you're like, oh my God, I'm so tired, I have these episodes tomorrow. I can almost every time, I can't really think of a time where I've recorded a podcast and I haven't had real satisfaction at the end of it, because you feel like you've achieved something good. And so it reminds me, the parallel is kind of working out, is that the thought of working out sometimes, or going to the gym, it's one of those things sometimes you have to motivate yourself to do, but typically most of the time after you've been, you feel pretty good about it. And that's what podcasting feels to me like almost every episode.
100%. I agree with that.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Just how something that is a hobby or is a passion can still be something that is tough for you to do. And sometimes you hear of like high level athletes who become lost in the sport that they committed so much of their life to and end up being a bit bitter and hating it. But I just think that it's probably a trait or a characteristic that's shared by everyone that has a strong passion for something, is that you want to continue to love it, but there are moments where your passion for it is overshadowed by the difficulty to keep maintaining and attain the levels that you want to reach without complete burnout. And that's the word that keeps coming to mind for me, without complete burnout. So you were talking about your process, and I'm interested to know which part of the podcasting processes are most interesting to you. And this is a bit of a loaded question, because alongside this, the thing that stands out to me particularly about Brains Byte Back, which sometimes I find really hard to say.
Yeah, everyone does.
Is the research element, because these are complex topics, and I know you have background or interest in a lot of these topics that you're talking about. But you talked about the nervousness a little bit, or apprehension as a host, to always thinking of a response to an answer. And I look at your podcast and I'm fascinated by a number of the topics that you cover on that particular podcast. But I also know how much research goes into podcasting, or can be put into podcasting. It's an area that I actually I really enjoy, but I also know how time consuming it is. So just how much time do you put into the research for your podcast? What are you learning about all these areas for the first time?
I would say that I'm fortunate enough that I kind of loop it in with my natural interests. So I have been lucky enough to start this podcast because these are topics that I'm interested in. And I spend a lot of time on Reddit. So I read a lot of news, a lot of research out of the psychology Reddit forum. And essentially, if I see something that interests me, I will go down that road. Then I have a source a guest. And a lot of the time, like I said, I don't go into these episodes with a lot of prior knowledge. More of interest and curiosity based on a few snippets and things that I've seen in the news and media. And then having this guest on is almost my opportunity to, I wouldn't say do the research, but opportunity to certainly learn more about this. So I come into every episode with the perspective that I am a novice in this area with a lot of curiosity, and I'm on the call with someone that is an expert that can answer all of my questions. And that's how I kind of lean into these. But I would say that it can be difficult at times to come up with the creativity behind these episodes, just because I think we're 60 or 70 episodes in now, and coming up with unique topics and angles, especially that relate to psychology and technology, which is kind of like a niche overlap, that can be quite difficult. But there's always new stuff going on in the world of technology, and psychology to me fascinates me, and I think that we've got plenty more episodes and plenty more topics to explore. So I'm looking forward to seeing what I come up with and what I want to explore, and also what I receive pitches for, because on many occasions I receive pitches, and they're quite interesting, and I'm like, yeah, let's go with it. I'll have them on.
Talking about that research process, that makes a lot of sense to me. Are there any episodes that stand out to you for Brains Byte Back that, and I say this, but giving you my perspective, listening to those podcasts, I sometimes have to re-listen to sections of them to really understand what's happening. And you're responding live to the answers that you're giving by these really, really smart people. You're very intelligent yourself, and it's just a lot to consume. It's a lot to digest. I think you're recording kind of a podcast that I could listen to more than once, and I'd find something new every time. Do you feel that way about them as well?
Yeah, definitely. Because, and first of all, thank you for your kind words. It's that's what I mean when I'm like, oh, I've got a terrible night's sleep and I've got to get on the phone and talk about this sort of AI related thing. I'm like, oh no. But yeah, I would say that sometimes I'm listening back or editing an episode and I'm like, that's a really interesting point. I'm kind of glad that I get to listen over to every episode again through editing it, because there are some points in there which really do interest me. And that's why I also feel so under pressure to respond with something interesting, because this person comes on the call, has a really interesting point, and then I'm like, crap, I got to say something. And I feel often, I wouldn't say intimidated, but I feel under pressure to deliver something great which matches their response or answer. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of pressure there. But
I think you do a great job of it.
Thank you.
And I'm not just saying this because you're here and you're a guest, but I'm blown away by you being able to hold your own in those conversations based on the amount of research you've just said you do and your natural curiosity. It comes across to me, and a lot of I haven't listened to all of your episodes, but the handful or more of episodes that I've listened to, it comes across as if you've got some experience in the disciplines that you're talking about, and you do to an extent, but the guests that you're speaking with are on a really high level in their respective fields. And so, yeah, that's a huge compliment that I can pay to you and that podcast in particular. And I put myself in your shoes and just thought to myself, that must be a lot of research that goes into those episodes. And I totally know how you feel when you're saying about the night before and thinking, I want to create a good episode and I want to respond, but I'm a little bit worried about this, and making sure that I can pull my weight and with an episode.
Well, thank you, man. That's good to hear. I got to say, like, the only thing that has really helped is just doing more of it, like having this as a weekly podcast. You kind of build on the knowledge you have. So when I've done an episode on something similar, but in the past, I always relate back to it, and it's kind of something just snowballs from there. Like, as a weekly kind of podcast, it's easy to listen and just take in information as I go.
And your point about editing was interesting as well, because I don't mind editing anymore for the reason that you just said, is that I've kind of got over this hearing my own voice thing. It's definitely something that's uncomfortable to begin with. But now when I'm editing podcasts, I'm not really thinking about my voice that much. I'm thinking about the topics that are being discussed and those little nuggets of information or anecdotes that, while you were experiencing it live as a host, you didn't really realize what were happening. And then you listen back and it kind of sits with you for a while. I really like having those moments. And I imagine that happens a lot on the podcast that you host.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely.
And that actually leads me on to another question about the podcast and what you're doing is I want to know the advice that you've applied. So you're doing this out of curiosity. You've created a career out of it. And again, I've got in front of me lists of topics that you cover. And again, I'd recommend listeners to this podcast to go check out Brains Byte Back and Loudspeaker. But particularly Brains Byte Back is one that resonates with me because I'm interested in the topics. So I've seen everything covered from sleep to psychedelics to alternative therapies, AI. The one that I'm really looking forward to listen, I haven't finished it, but the critical thinking episode, because that's on my mind a lot lately. And the one that you referenced that I haven't listened to, which is smart cities. So I want to listen to that episode as well. I just want to know, you're speaking as a host, you're listening to all this information, you're editing it back. You must get so much good information that you want to apply to your life. Are there any lessons that you've taken that you have applied to your life in any of those areas of psychology that have made a real difference to your well-being, your productivity, or your career?
The funny thing is, I don't know if I've consciously taken it. It's almost like I've absorbed them, but not like got fixated on them. So it's not something that I necessarily think like, oh, that's a really interesting piece of information. I feel that because it's my work, it's kind of just absorbed into my knowledge or understanding. And it's kind of like if you learn a language and you try to think or speak in it, but you don't really have the confidence. But then when you're put in that situation, like you need to read something, you're like, wow, I understood that. Or someone said something, you're like, actually, I understood that. Like your brain kind of just reacts in a certain way. I feel like my brain's kind of absorbed information through this podcast in the same way that I pretty know more than I think. But when I'm asked, like, what do you know? It's like, I don't know, actually. But I would say one thing that certainly I've been very passionate about lately, because it comes up so much in our shows, is heuristics. So essentially just like the mental shortcuts that our brains take. So we had an episode on online casinos and how they use tactics and psychological ploys to trick people. Heuristics came up in there, and critical thinking as well. Heuristics, biases came up in that. That was a major one where that came up. Also like cancel culture, social media. And this week's episode, that came out is based entirely on heuristics. So I think for me, that has always been something I've been very passionate about in psychology, but only recently have I fully explored it to the extent that I wanted to. And have I really understood heuristics to the level that I have done since university. So I would say that I've been fortunate enough to be able to pursue that, and that is something that I found very interesting. And I would say that when you're aware of your cognitive biases, when you're aware of how your brain tricks you up or how you might misinterpret information, it makes you far more vigilant of that in your life. You can say, wait, am I thinking that because of this or because of this? So you're able to dissect your own thought processes more as a result of knowing these things, I'd say.
I was only just listening to your last podcast before this, actually. So I was actually between podcasts. It's rare. I didn't actually mention this, but it's rare that I record more than one podcast in a day. And that's because of what we were just talking about in terms of research and preparation. I try not to do 2 on a day, but I had one for the internet marketing podcast I recorded for Site Visibility, and I had this one organized with you. And I thought, what should I do between recordings? And I thought, I'll put myself in the mood to listen to Sam and see what he's talking about lately. And I was listening to that episode. I've not finished it yet, but that's a good example, that your latest episode of one where I know I'm going to have to listen to it back, because I'm listening to the stories and the anecdotes and the information that's being shared and trying to absorb it. But it's one that, over here, it's the end of my day, and I really think that I need my brain to be fresh to absorb the information that's being shared in that particular episode. That was interesting to me. I know we're towards the end of this episode now and closing up, but one thing I am curious about, so you're on this podcast marketing course, was that right?
Yeah, Podcast Marketing Academy, yeah.
And you did allude earlier to the fact that you have this curiosity around, maybe curiosity, intrigue, maybe it sits with you, this feeling, why are some episodes performing better than another? That feeling, which is somewhat vanity, somewhat curiosity. Again, I share that feeling sometimes. The Advertising Hour podcast is fairly new, so I'm not really in the same mind frame of worrying about the episode figures at this particular point. I'm just building up a repertoire of podcasts and enjoying going through the process of finding the character of this podcast. But the internet marketing podcast is far more well established and has quite a high number of listeners. And so I look at the figures for those podcasts and often wonder the same things. And I'm curious to know any sweet spots that you found during podcasts that you think naturally translate to traction or to engagement, whether that's through more listeners, more social media interactions, more comments. And I'm thinking about things like formats, lengths, topics. Does anything stand out to you about what you've learned so far?
Well, one thing that I'm trying to aim it towards is, I suppose, understanding who's listening and why. And of course, that's kind of a hard thing because we're at the intersection between like psychology and technology. So not everyone that's going to be techie is perhaps going to be into psychology. And again, not everyone that's going to be into psychology might be into technology. So trying to find that balance is hard. But one thing I have found is whenever we have an episode which is applicable to one subject, and specifically like psychology, like I mentioned before, if I put that into the Reddit, which is most applicable for that subject. So, for example, Reddit psychology, and it's an episode strongly dedicated to psychology, then it gets a good reception. It's well received. So I would say understanding and knowing where to put a podcast episode, depending on the audience and the type of people that are going to enjoy it. I don't know if that answers your question. Is that?
Yeah, no, that does make so. To summarize what you're saying, it's to really think about the episode's content and match that to the medium of choice for marketing, not just think about amplifying, not to think about the process of marketing when it comes to podcasting as a process. So a lot of people think, okay, I've got this episode, I have to share it on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, create an audiogram for all of the platforms, create story content for it, which maybe is valid, but you're saying actually go beyond that and maybe find the communities that you think will resonate most with this podcast and go share it there. And in your case, in a couple of instances, that's been Reddit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, spot on. Yeah, I would definitely say that is something that I'm striving towards as much as possible.
Brilliant. Sam, I know you have to go, and I'm so thankful for your time. So to wrap up, do you want to let our listeners here know where they can find out more about you, the podcast that you host, and any other information you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, they can find Brains Byte Back on any of their podcasting platforms. So that's Brains, then Byte, spelled Byte, and Back. And same with the Loudspeaker. You search for that on any of your podcasting platforms, you'll be able to find it. And if anyone does want to reach out and contact me or just get in touch, then they can find me on LinkedIn. So it's Sam Brake spelled Brake, and then Guia spelled Guia. So Sam space Brake space Guia. And I'm happy to see what we can do. And again, Scott, thank you so much for having me on today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And it's nice to chat with someone that's feels like very much on the same page for many things, and kind of just hash out ideas and thoughts in a space which I don't usually get the opportunity to kind of have these conversations with someone that's on the same level like this. So I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
No problem. Me too. And thanks for all your work. You have a subscriber in me for both podcasts, but particularly for Brains Byte Back, because just all the topics resonate with me, and I've loved listening to you speak today and to hear about your experiences. So thank you so much. All the best with all your podcasts and career moving forward. I look forward to catching up in the future and seeing everything that you create.
Excellent.
Thanks again.
Thanks, man.
Brilliant. Take care. Bye-bye.